Midnight paints the farm the color of alarm. A thin orange line crawls across my corn and then leaps. Dry stalks snap and roar as heat pushes at my face and sirens stutter somewhere down the county road. For weeks she waved violation notices at my fence, pointed at my tractor, called it an eyesore. Tonight the cameras watch her taillights settle by the far gate. By dawn the field is black and the story looks finished. It isn't. Every acre was insured, documented, and mapped. What burned was evidence. What survived was a paper trail worth $2 million, and a reckoning she never saw coming. Most mornings in our street looked the same. The sun slid over identical roofs, sprinklers ticked across clipped lawns, and the cul-de-sac filled with the quiet shuffle of people heading to work. I liked the rhythm of it. Coffee on the porch, a quick lap with the dog, a glance at the neighbor's roses and the row of matching mailboxes the HOA had installed last spring. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt orderly, safe, predictable. When we bought the house, predictability was the selling point. The HOA brochure promised curb appeal, stable values, and a friendly community that took pride in appearances. The rules read like common sense. Keep grass low, keep cars off the street overnight, paint within the approved palette. I signed the packet, filed it away, and went back to building the kind of life that doesn't need attention. I worked from a small office at the back of the house, kept the porch light warm in the evenings, and put in 2 raised beds along the side fence, tucked out of the line of sight from the street. Lettuce, tomatoes, a few herbs, nothing that shouted. We settled into the community rhythm. The board sent seasonal emails about holiday lights and pressure washing. There were newsletters with photos from the block party, reminders about speed limits, and calls for volunteers for the architecture committee, which sounded grand for a group that mostly reviewed paint chips. Casual waves turned into names. We learned who watered at dawn, who ran at dusk, who left early on Mondays. The quiet was a comfort. It was the kind of quiet you don't notice until it's gone. Small details started to stand out. A neighbor who never waved but always looked. A laser-straight hedge trimmed to the inch along a property line. Measuring tapes. Phone cameras held low but level. On the community page, posts appeared about standards and consistency, written in the tone of someone who loves rules more than people. It was easy to scroll by. Every neighborhood has someone who polishes the mailbox posts and keeps a tally of whose bins are left out past noon. I told myself it was harmless. The raised beds grew well. The drip line worked. The soil held moisture and the plants filled in. From the street you could barely see them, but from my office window they were a green stripe that made the day feel a little lighter. I kept them neat. No tools left out, no stray bags of mulch. On weekends I raked the side path, swept the pavers, and closed the gate. I believed that care would be enough. A few incidents nudged the calm. A reminder in the newsletter about unauthorized exterior modifications, with a list too vague to be helpful. A note on the community page about light pollution, paired with a photo of a porch that looked like mine, though you couldn't be sure. A car idled a bit longer than normal at our curb one evening. Headlights off, screen glow bright inside. The dog bristled at the side gate a few times at night. None of it rose to the level of trouble. All of it made our house feel like it was being watched. I started to learn how the rules actually worked. It wasn't just a handbook. It was a stack of interpretations, past decisions and preferences that shifted with whoever held the clipboard. The architecture committee met in a side room at the clubhouse, and submissions were encouraged, even for changes that didn't need them. People spoke in phrases like precedent and community standards. There was a quiet hierarchy to it, a way things were done if you wanted to stay invisible. We kept our heads down. We matched our paint to the approved swatch when we touched up the trim. We kept the porch light dimmer at night. We pushed the bins back the same day. I told myself this was goodwill, not fear. The raised bed stayed neat, the gate stayed locked, and the dog learned to ignore the sounds in the side yard. The first sign arrived with a color that didn't belong in our street. A bright orange paper, laminated against the weather, tied to our side gate. The headline was bold enough to read from 10 paces. It had a case number. It had a deadline. It had a tone that turned a garden into a violation and care into defiance. I stood there in the quiet morning light, hearing the sprinklers and the distant hum of the road, and understood that the rhythm of our street was about to change. The orange notice on the side gate did not explain much, but it did not need to. It carried a case number and a clock. I took a photo of it, filed the image in a folder on my desktop labeled with the date, and walked the length of our fence with a notepad. The raised beds were tidy. The drip line was intact. The gate latch was firm. Nothing looked like a threat to property values. unless the threat was the idea that a person could tend to something without asking permission first. By afternoon, the first email arrived. It said I had made an unapproved exterior modification and must submit a retroactive application to the architecture committee. It linked to a form that requested sketches to scale, photographs from multiple angles, and proof that the change did not affect any easements, sightlines, or fire safety considerations. It carried a fee for review, and a warning that the fee did not guarantee approval. I paid the fee, completed the form, and sent everything in. I added the submission receipt to the same folder as the photo of the notice. A tidy history felt like armor. A week later, a second notice appeared on the gate. This one yellow, and the fines began. The first was small. The second doubled when I did not remove the beds while the committee reviewed my application. The third attached a phrase that would come to define the next month's ongoing violation. With each letter, the tone shifted from neighborly upkeep to legal posture. The mail slot began to deliver thick envelopes with reference numbers in the corner and lists of rules that kept expanding with each citation. The raised beds had become a lens through which everything else could be judged. Little frictions multiplied. The porch light, once considered warm, was now labeled too bright. The bins, once tucked back by lunchtime, were reported as visible from the street beyond an acceptable number of minutes. A board member paused longer in front of our house and photographed the truck parked in the driveway, with two wheels crossing an invisible tape line on the concrete. A hazard tag appeared on the maple by the curb because its leaves dropped unevenly. Each small thing branched into paperwork. Each small thing added to the feeling that the house was being documented more than it was being lived in. I tried to learn the system. Minutes from past meetings were public, so I read them. A pattern surfaced. Disputes rarely centered on safety or structural risk. They centered on taste, on what could be seen, on whether someone's preference had the weight of law. Appeals were theoretically available, but they sat behind deadlines and formatting rules that reset the moment you met them. Variances required neighbor consent, but came with language discouraging neighbors from signing. Compliance dates jumped forward when weekends intervened. It was a maze designed so that winning meant not entering. I submitted the retroactive application exactly as required. A week became 2. I followed up and received an answer that the committee could not locate my file. I forwarded the submission receipt and the photographs again. This time the committee acknowledged receipt, but the next notice said my application was incomplete because I had not included a certified property survey with the raised beds sketched precisely on it. I requested a copy of the survey from the title office, drew the beds on a transparent overlay, and sent both. The next rejection said the overlay had to be drawn by a licensed professional. The goalposts did not move in large leaps. They inched. In early summer, the drip line failed and I rebuilt it. I took photos of every step. The connectors, the clamps, the exact path of the line, the hose timer with the timestamp visible. It felt absurd and necessary at the same time. The side yard looked like a small, private farm, neat and humble, just food and care. From the street, almost nothing showed, but the phrase agricultural use began to appear in the notices, and it came packaged with another term, view corridor. The beds were said to interrupt a sight line that, on a map, cut across our fence at the exact angle a particular board member drove to her house. It did not matter that the bed sat behind the fence out of sight. The map said disruption. The map was law. I appealed to the management company, which meant emailing a different address and filling out a different form. A meeting was set, not for the board, but for a 3-person panel that handled owner concerns. The panel met on a weekday afternoon in a room with carpet that smelled like detergent and a wall clock that ran 5 minutes fast. I brought a binder of photographs and receipts, the survey, the letters, the fines, printouts of the rules, and a timeline. The panel thanked me for my thoroughness and said the issue would be evaluated holistically. When the decision arrived, it said the panel did not have jurisdiction to overrule the architecture committee. The fines increased. The letters darkened. The phrase possible lien appeared and sat humming under the paragraphs like a live wire. Sleep thinned. I recorded the board's morning walks on my cameras and learned their route by habit. I learned which cars slowed, which phones angled, which corners of our property drew the longest looks. I learned that being watched can feel like a hand on your shoulder, even when no one stands near you. I moved the raised beds 3 inches inward and sent new photos with measurements. The response said the shift confirmed the original violation because it proved the beds had been in the wrong position before. I covered the beds with neutral canvas to shield them from view. The response said the covers were non-compliant structures. I swapped the crops to lower plants, cut down the tallest sunflowers and kept the edges clipped. The response said the activity was continuous cultivation, and therefore prohibited. The logic circled. The problem was the thing and also any evidence that the thing was being managed responsibly. Summer heat drew scent out of the soil. The dog's paws tracked clean footprints along the pavers after early watering. I noticed the side gate latch marked by fresh scratches and added a second lock. 2 days later, I found the drip line punctured in 4 places and repaired it with couplers I had already bought for that exact possibility. The cameras showed a figure along the fence line after midnight, hard to identify, moving the way a person moves when they already know the path. The footage went into the folder. I sent a security update to the management company. The reply said maintenance of private irrigation systems was the owner's responsibility. Online, the community page turned sharper. Photos of unsightly projects circulated with captions about standards. The angle always cut off the context. A pile of mulch waiting to be spread looked like neglect. A tarp covering tools looked like junk. The comments wore politeness like a thin coat of paint. Phrases like property values and shared expectations made their rounds. People I had waved to at the mailbox posted underneath with suggestions that the board hold the line. It became clear that the board's power did not come from a few rules. It came from the many hands willing to hold a rule steady. When the architecture committee finally issued a formal decision, it did not say denied, it said approved with conditions. The conditions required removal of the raised beds and a stand-down period during which any gardening activity beyond potted plants required express written consent. The wording read like compromise while functioning as total restriction. The fines for the months in between remained due. The decision included a deadline for compliance and a reminder that failure would result in enforcement. I thought about compliance. It would be easier to pull everything out, sweep the pavers bare, and live under a rule that saw life as risk. I stood in the side yard with a rake and listened to the sound that had drawn me to this in the first place. Water tapping soil, sprigs of new growth pushing leaves through light. The small, orderly proof that effort can turn into something you can hold. I chose to document instead. The folder on my desktop became a ledger. I mapped the beds. I logged every seed packet, every bag of soil, every minute the hose ran. Photographed yields with a ruler and weighed produce on a scale with the date in frame. If the board was building a case, I would build a record. Late in the summer, I added one change that would shape what came next. Inside the fence, in a strip that got full midday sun, I planted a narrow block of sweet corn. It was not much, just enough for a few shared barbecues and a sense of plenty. But it grew fast and straight, green stalks like a small, whispering forest. The rules specified height limits for hedges and trees, but they did not anticipate corn. The board called it an unapproved screen. I sent the language from the handbook back and received silence. The silence did not mean approval. It meant a different strategy would arrive. It arrived as fire risk. The committee circulated a memo about combustible vegetation and defensible space, written in the tone of a public safety announcement, illustrated with stock photos of wildland blazes. The map of our neighborhood included shading over our fence line and a bright outline over the side yard. The memo named no one. It did not need to. A second memo followed with a schedule for seasonal compliance checks. The day after that, a stranger in a high-vis vest walked the lane between fences with a clipboard and a laser measuring device. I asked the management company for the assessment notes and received a reply saying the inspection results were internal. The pace of the letters changed. Now they spoke of urgent mitigation, of elevated hazard, of exposure the community could not tolerate. The fines converted into emergency assessments with due dates that cut through weekends and holidays. The tone of neighborly policy sharpened into the cadence of threat. I reviewed my cameras more often. I adjusted the motion zones. I set alerts to push to my phone at any movement by the side gate. I learned to recognize headlights by shape. The habit did not feel like paranoia. It felt like preparation. At the edge of town, a friend with a drone offered to map the yard for fun, and I said yes with sincerity that surprised me. The images stitched into a precise snapshot. Every bed, every line, every gate. We saved the file with time and coordinates. In the evenings, I cross-referenced the map with the rules. I learned the phrase, record of condition. It meant proof of what existed at a particular moment. Proof that could be measured, checked, verified. Proof that stood even when a board said memory was inconvenient. Harvest edged closer. The sweet corn topped out and flagged with silk. The side yard smelled like sun-warmed green. I picked the first ears with the careful excitement of someone doing something simple after months of complexity. The camera on the far corner caught a car idling without lights 2 houses down. It reversed slowly and left. The footage went into the folder. The next week, a letter arrived with a new heading, Pre-Lion Notice. It itemized months of fines, fees, assessments, and administrative costs, and gave a final deadline. I laid the pages out on the dining table like a blueprint of a plan. The plan was pressure. Pressure to make me fold. Pressure to make the side yard disappear. And with it the idea that a rule could be met without surrendering dignity. I felt the pressure, and I felt something else growing alongside it. A thin, steady determination to meet the game with a ledger the board did not expect. I pulled the policy, documents on our home and business coverage, and asked a series of methodical questions to a person whose job was to locate edges in definitions. The policies had riders and endorsements I had never read carefully. Lines about personal property used for incidental income. Clauses about improvements and scheduled items. Sections on malicious damage and vandalism. I documented what applied and what did not. I photographed receipts. I created a subfolder called Coverage inside the main folder, populated it with PDFs, and wrote a summary in plain language line by line, to make sure I understood it when stress made thoughts slippery. The last week of summer, the heat held late into the evening. The air felt dry enough to crack. The motion alerts spiked. Cats, wind-tossed branches. A board member's walk taken earlier than usual. I watered at dawn and let the ground cool before I touched anything. When I checked the drip line at the far corner, the plastic felt brittle. I replaced a section and added the old piece to a box where I kept damaged parts, each labeled with date and location. It was ridiculous and it was necessary. In a fight about what is real, a labeled object argues better than a memory. On a Thursday, the management company emailed a reminder that the seasonal compliance check would occur the next morning at 7. At 6:30, I stood by the side gate with a mug, watching the sky turn the color of coin metal. The inspector walked the lane, paused at our fence, recorded something on the device, and left. At noon, the board posted a congratulatory note on the community page about proactive safety culture. The comments praised vigilance. I saved a screenshot. Friday night, the wind lifted and thinned. The neighborhood looked like it always looked. Lights soft in windows, televisions flickering, dogs shifting in their sleep, sprinklers ticking in the distance. My phone vibrated with a motion alert from the far camera, and then another, a few minutes apart. No clear image, just the shape of someone who knew where shadows were thicker. I watched in real time as a pair of taillights idled beyond the lane, and then dipped out of sight. I stood up from the chair before the next alert arrived, because the next alert always did. This time, a different color flickered at the edge of the frame, not the cold blue of the LED lamps, not the white glare of reversing lights. A warmer color, low and crawling, the color that eats what it can reach if nobody stops it. The footage kept rolling. The air on the other side of the wall began to carry a smell I recognized. The neighborhood slept. The board's memos about hazard turned into a map in my head. And for the first time, the map made a new kind of sense. The night held its breath. The corn rustled once and went quiet. The night held its breath. The corn rustled once and went quiet. On the far camera, a low band of color crawled along the fence, weak at first, then hungry. Heat lifted the air in a steady shimmer. The smell reached the porch before the sound did. Dry stalks turned into quick fuel. A thin fuse racing in 2 directions at once. I moved without thinking. Hose valve, main switch, extinguisher, gravel under shoes. The first spray met the flame with a hiss that sounded like relief and defiance at the same time. In the background, the phone counted out the seconds as it sent the footage to the cloud and dialed for help. Windows brightened across the cul-de-sac. A neighbor's porch light cut on. Headlights crept to the curb and idled there, just far enough to watch. The glow rising from the side yard painted the lower halves of the fence pickets in soft amber, until one panel blackened, curled, and let go. The fire took a breath, looked for something larger, found only watered soil and green stems, and stumbled. It tried again along a second line that had appeared as if by script. 3 starts, 3 angles. Not a spark carried on wind. Not an accident. Sirens grew from a distant stutter to a clean, hard sound that held its note as a truck turned into the street. Boots hit pavement in a quick rhythm. Hose couplings clanged, and the first sweep flattened the flame with cold certainty. Steam rolled back over the yard and turned the corn patch into a dark, wet outline of what had stood there at dusk. The field was not large. Not a farm by any measure that mattered to a map, but in that moment it felt like a test the neighborhood had set for itself. What burned was not just a plant, it was permission. When the noise thinned, the work of figuring out began. A flashlight beam traced low arcs across the soil, Gloved hands parted damp ash with the patience of someone used to finding beginnings in endings. Two things stood out in the light. Lines of deeper black that ran like seams through the patch, pore trails, and a dull silver shape half buried near the gate latch where the camera had last seen a moving shadow. Cap, a kind sold at the hardware store 3 miles away, not proof by itself, but a thread that led somewhere instead of nowhere. I brought the ledger I had built for months. The binder opened to the map we had made with the drone, date, and GPS printed at the top. Page after page followed. Photographs labeled by angle and time. The survey overlay, the emails, the notices. The pre-lion letter with its demanding tone. The hazard memos dressed as community service announcements. The compliance inspection time-stamped less than 12 hours earlier. Next to each document I had noted what it meant in plain language. Because panic turns intelligent minds into fog. The task now was simple. Show the difference between what existed at noon and what existed at midnight. The investigator drew a straight line between the 3 ignition points and the lane behind the fence. The camera footage filled in what the fence hid. A figure, face turned away, moved with the certainty of someone who had walked the length before. The taillights in the distance did not just glow. They flickered in a pattern that matched a model with a distinct rear signal. The same model that sat under a particular carport 3 houses down by day. The far street camera, owned by the city and aimed at the stop sign, had its own memory. It did not care who knew whom. It simply kept time. Phone alerts stacked in the corner of the screen while the scene cooled. Management's blast email landed first. An earnest note about a vegetation fire event, and gratitude that community hazard planning had averted wider damage. It framed the night as proof that their memos had been wisdom instead of wind. Tried to move the story to a place where no one had to ask how 3 ignition points appeared at once. I saved the message. Then I wrote my own, concise and careful. A litigation hold sent to the board, the management company, and their committee accounts, instructing them to preserve all communications, drafts, and inspection data related to combustible vegetation, seasonal compliance, and my property. The note carried a case number assigned at the curb, and the names of agencies now involved. It was not angry. Anger is what people expect from a neighbor. Documentation is what changes posture. Within an hour, silence replaced the management emails. Silence in a neighborhood that loved to talk. The board's private channel would not be quiet, but the public page held still as a frozen lake. The quiet felt like a shared breath no one wanted to release. I did not fill it. I kept working. I exported the relevant clips and copied them to a drive with read-only permissions. I printed a timeline that ran like a train schedule from the first orange notice to the last ember. I added the box of repaired drip line pieces, each labeled with date and location of damage over the past months. Not as accusation, but as pattern. Patterns make sense when single events look like bad luck. At noon the next day, the city camera record came back. A car without its lights rolled to the mouth of the lane at 11:42 p.m. and eased in. At 11:56 p.m., the same car reversed out, paused as if waiting for a signal from the side of the fence, and left. Its registration was not a mystery in a town where plates and names are a matter of form, not secrecy. The owner's address put it on the same block, in the circle of people with power over the memos that had made my side yard a target. The distance between paper and ash narrowed until it felt like one thing. By dusk, the neighborhood gathered its composure. The board called an informational session for the next evening at the clubhouse. The notice framed it as support in a time of stress, a chance to address rumors, a reminder to avoid speculation. The language did careful work, concerned, measured, paternal. I brought my binder, the drive, the printed timeline, and one new page, an addendum titled Record of Condition, with 3 images side by side. The drone map, the post-inspection photo from the morning before, and the first frame of fire on the camera overnight. 3 images that said nothing at noon, everything by midnight. The room filled with folding chairs and the scent of disinfectant. A slideshow clicked through slides about safety and collaboration. Faces turned when the investigator walked in and stood at the back. No one needed to introduce him. The sequence of authority was clear. The person with water, the person with a badge, the person with a file. When the floor opened for questions, I did not make a speech. Speeches are for winning opinions. Evidence is for changing outcomes. I handed the drive to the person who would decide what to do next and let the screen speak. A lane, a fence line, 3 dark pour lines sparkling in infrared as they took a flame and mirrored a plan. Murmurs moved like wind through tall grass. A board member studied the carpet as if numbers had been stitched into it. Another reached for a phone and then stopped halfway. Control was a currency in that room, and it shifted with each frame that rolled. It shifted more when the investigator closed his notebook and stepped outside to make a call. By morning, what moved quietly in inboxes moved openly on the street. 2 officers crossed a driveway 3 houses down with a steady, practiced walk and left with a phone in a sealed bag. Another knock came at the management office door, and someone whose job had been email triage and meeting minutes handed over keys to a cabinet no one ever looked in until they had to. The story that had been shaped as vegetation hazard began to read differently. Hazard still existed. It just wore a different face. Throughout, I stayed where my footing was strongest. I sent the claim packet I had prepared in the hour after the fire was out. Policy numbers, photographs, inventories, receipts, the drone map, the weight logs, the repair labels, the timeline, and the section of the endorsement most people skip past, scheduled personal property and improvements, with a declared value for incidental agricultural use. The amount was not a guess. It had been documented before the first memo about combustible vegetation ever went out. The page with the figure sat behind my gate all summer, while fines piled up, and notices grew bold. Now it moved center stage, not as brag, but as outcome. Malicious damage is a phrase with teeth when it meets coverage. Subrogation is the next word insurance companies say after that. The board tried a familiar move, a statement about cooperation and commitment to transparency. It mentioned community standards and urged patience. It did not mention the car. It did not mention the cap by the gate, or the inspections, or the internal emails that would have to be produced now that a hold letter existed with signatures below it. The statement floated for an hour and then sank under the weight of a different current. People who had watched themselves be measured and photographed for months, and now saw the tool turn the other way. I stood in the side yard at noon and looked at a rectangle of black soil shaped like a missing page, damp and flat. The only color came from the edges where green met char. Somewhere a sprinkler ticked 3 houses over. Somewhere a phone vibrated with a new email. In my pocket, another vibration. An acknowledgement from the insurer that the claim had been received and assigned to a special investigations unit. A separate note showed up a minute later from a person whose title used words like recovery and coordination. Paper trails, when braided, pull more than weight. They pull direction. The corner camera caught a line of cars moving slower than usual past our fence, each driver trying not to look and failing. They were not just watching a neighbor's bad luck. They were watching a center of gravity shift. For months, the board's confidence had been the brightest thing in the room. Now it was an image on a screen that kept looping back to the same seconds and asking the same silent question. Why? The answer would come later in documents and statements and a court that prefers facts over tone. For now, the shape of what mattered had changed. The field was burned, but the record was intact. The rules had teeth, but so did the ledger. What started as a garden had become a case, and the hands that tried to make it a lesson for everyone else had taught a different one entirely. By sunset, the yard held still, a pause between 2 kinds of days. Behind me, the binder lay open to a page with 2 numbers circled in ink, the case number at the top of the report, and the insured value beside the word scheduled. In front of me, the fence line ran straight and honest across the property, unbothered by what people wanted it to mean. Somewhere down the block, a door shut, a car engine turned, and a plan made in whispers braced for daylight. The next part would not be about smoke. It would be about receipts. Morning made everything look smaller than the night before, but it didn't make it less real. The char was a neat rectangle, the fence a dark ledger line, the soil flattened like a stamp pad. The investigator returned at first light, took one more pass with the camera, and left with the cap from the lane sealed in a bag. The neighborhood reset its routine around the outline of what had happened. Dog walkers paused. Car engines lingered and idle. Sprinklers ticked with extra care. The quiet that had once felt like safety now felt like a blank page waiting for marks. Paper arrived first. My insurer acknowledged the claim in writing, not as a courtesy, but as a process already in motion. The packet I had sent, maps, photos, weight logs, receipts, endorsements, cut through the part of claims work where people guess. The adjuster's note read like a checklist against my timeline. There were no gaps to argue about, only items to verify by sequence. The coverage that had looked like fine print now behaved like a machine. Scheduled personal property, improvements, malicious damage, subrogation. Numbers moved from one column to another with the calm of a train timetable. Enforcement moved next. The city's request for camera records returned more than a single angle. Street cameras watched intersections the way a watch keeps time. Registration data tied a car to an address most people already whispered. A warrant followed. Evidence does something to posture. It reduces it. The person who had written memos about combustible vegetation sat at a table under lights, meant for truth, and learned the cost of mistaking a neighbor's patience for weakness. The charge sheet used simple words: intent, ignition, damage. The board posted a statement about cooperation and the presumption of innocence. It asked for patience while the process took its course. The management company reposted it with a new header about community values. The tone was measured and soft. It did not mention the pre-lien notice they had slipped through my door 48 hours earlier. It did not mention the compliance inspection that happened the morning of the fire. It did not mention my hold letter, or the request for preservation that now covered their inboxes like a drop cloth. My focus narrowed to 2 tracks: rebuild and resolve. Rebuild was practical. I cleared the area under supervision and kept the debris until every agency told me I could let it go. I rinsed the fence and left the smoke stain visible long enough to be documented from more angles than I thought necessary. I planted nothing. The bare soil served as a kind of punctuation mark, while other work moved forward. Resolve lived on my desk. The binder earned a second volume for correspondence, exhibits, and a spreadsheet that summed the costs most people don't itemize. Time, labor, mitigation, interrupted use. The insurer did not haggle over the scheduled value. The point of scheduling is that the argument happens before the loss, not after. The number that lived on a page behind my gate all summer now lived on a letterhead with an instruction line: disbursement, method, timing. The figure sat heavy and precise. It did not feel like a windfall. It felt like a promise kept by paper. In a separate paragraph, the letter introduced the team that would pursue recovery against those responsible. Subrogation moves with its own patience. It does not argue online. It does not blink. Legal work followed the same rules I had used for months. Keep it plain, keep it documented, keep it moving. The civil action alleged harassment, selective enforcement, bad faith, and retaliation. It did not try to make a speech. It pointed to memos, to fines, to inspections, to nights when the drip line was cut and the dog bristled at the gate, to the way standards shifted when a person became a target, to the fire and the 3 dark seams in the soil that still showed at noon the next day, when the sun was high and honest. The complaint asked for what made sense: damages, fees, injunctive relief, structural changes to how rules were written and used. The defense began the way defenses begin, when institutions feel bigger than the people they govern. They said there was no animus, only policy. They said enforcement was even-handed. They said community safety had been their aim all along. Then disclosure started. Emails carry their own memory. Drafts that never left outboxes. Committee notes written in the comfort of assumed privacy. Screenshots from a group chat where jokes wear the mask of stress relief. The tone changed as the record widened. Policy sounds different when it sits beside planning. The criminal case moved too. A plea replaced a trial. Consequences were not cinematic. They were incremental and real. A conviction, a sentence, restitution orders. A permanent separation from any role that grants authority over other people's homes. The board member at the center of the fire resigned before the paperwork could make it an ouster. 2 others cited health reasons and left quietly. The management company's contract reached its renewal date and did not cross the line into another term. The HOA hired an interim firm with a mandate that read like a repair manual: audit, standardize, retrain, document, report. The neighborhood needed a meeting. It got several. The first was catharsis. People who had been measured for years suddenly had language for what they felt. The second was governance. A recall, a vote. A slate of names that did not campaign on firmness but on fairness and scope. Rules did not vanish. They changed shape. Fines capped at reasonable amounts and connected to actual risk. A standing requirement that inspections happen in pairs, by appointment, with a paper form left behind that lists what was checked and why. A duty to disclose interpretive changes before they are enforced. A mediation path that requires sitting at a table before letters become liens. The architecture committee became a different thing, with a different name. It stopped calling taste cohesion and started calling the handbook what it was: a list of boundaries we agree to share because we live close. The committee kept its paint chips and porch light guidelines. It let go of the habit of inventing new rules by email. The new chair published a calendar and minutes with enough detail that people could see how decisions were made, not just what they were. A neighbor who used to bring a measuring tape to the curb now brought coffee to meetings and learned a different way to feel important. The civil case resolved without a trial. Settlement terms arrived in formal paragraphs and then did their work in daily life. The HOA rescinded every fine, replaced them with a written apology, and covered fees and costs that had accumulated while I defended myself for growing food where it could barely be seen. The board adopted the injunctive terms into their operating documents, so they would outlast any single set of names. The management company, under pressure from its other clients watching, issued a memo about retraining across all properties they handle. It was part face-saving, part real change. I did not care which part weighed more. Results are heavier than motives. The insurer paid. Then it pursued. Recovery letters went out with case numbers and schedules. People who had been loose with words about holding the line learned what it feels like when the line holds them. The restitution order did not erase the scar along my fence, but it wrote something under it that would last longer than ash. A record of consequences. The person who had moved in shadows would not move through this community the same way again. The message traveled farther than our street. Rebuild began when the last formality in the criminal case was complete. I turned the charred rectangle with a spade and worked compost in like patience. I laid out new pavers, not as a statement but as a clean edge. I reinstalled the drip line and left its path visible for a week, so a new inspector, paired with a colleague as required, could see and sign. When I planted, I started small. Lettuce, tomatoes, herbs, the same quiet green that had made ordinary mornings feel like a kind of luck. Weeks later, with the air cooler and the new rules living on paper instead of in someone's head, I put a narrow row of corn back in the sun. It rustled again, not as proof, not as defiance, as life. The fence still carries a faint stain if you catch it late in the day. I kept one section unpainted as a private reminder that a straight line can be asked to mean too much. The cameras stayed, not because I expect another night like that, but because evidence is a better guardian than memory. The binder moved to a high shelf. I can reach it. I do not need to hold it. The impact across the street line shows up in small changes. People park straighter and wave longer. The community page posts fewer photos of eyesores and more notices about bake sales and lost cats. When someone new paints a door a shade too bold, a neighbor offers the approved swatch before the complaint form. The architecture committee still exists, but it speaks in public and prefers clarity to surprise. Inspectors knock, introduce themselves, and leave a copy of the form they filled. The management company that replaced the last one sends emails that feel like service rather than pressure. The word standard still appears, but it shares its space with trust. Property values did not collapse. They breathed. For a quarter they dipped under rumor and then lifted as stability returned in a form that meant something. Audited books, clear rules, people staying. Buyers notice more than paint colors. They notice how a place treats those who live there. Real order does not need a measuring tape at the curb to prove itself. For me, the change is quieter. Sleep returned. Mornings look like they did when we moved in, only sharper around the edges. I still walk the fence with a mug. I still glance at the mailbox row and the roses. But now I also see a meeting room with open blinds and a calendar posted on the door. I see a row of names that changed because paper and patience pushed. I see that a garden can be food and also a boundary, and that the right kind of boundary keeps people safe rather than small. What did I learn that might matter to someone watching this from a kitchen table that smells like coffee and worry? That rules are not the same as fairness. That documenting is not paranoia when the pressure is quiet and constant. That calm is a kind of strength when others want you loud and careless. That your ledger, kept in plain language with dates and photos, can be more powerful than someone else's confidence voiced in a room with a microphone. I learned something else too. Insurance is not magic, and it is not an enemy. It is a contract you can understand before you need it. Read the endorsements. Ask the dull questions when there is no fire. Decide what part of your life needs numbers attached to it, and then attach them. Protect what you can so that if someone tries to take the rest, they run into language that does not move. The street will forget the details. People will move away, and new families will inherit the shade under the maple, and the way the asphalt gleams after rain. The stain on the fence will fade under primer and sun. The meeting minutes will store what happened in neat lines of text that no one will read unless they have to. Memory will do what it does, but process will remain. The new rules will still require 2 inspectors and a form. The cap from the lane sits in an evidence room with a label that carries the date and my street name, and a case number that taught a lesson louder than any speech. On the last evening of the season, I stood by the renewed row of corn and listened to it move in a light breeze, the sound like paper turning. The dog lay in the clean dust where the first row would start next year. The porch light glowed at a level the handbook now defines plainly. Across the cul-de-sac, a neighbor watered roses with a hose set to mist and waved with the kind of wave that says, "We live here, and we learned something." What burned that night was a patch of green and a certain kind of arrogance. What did not burn was the ledger, the patience, and the idea that a home is more than a place to enforce taste. In the end, the payout arrived. The charges stuck, the rules changed, and the garden grew back. The board discovered that power without restraint is a short story. The community learned that fairness is good for property values and better for sleep. If your street looks calm now, ask yourself a simple thing before the next notice slides under your door. When rules become weapons, what record will you hold in your hands?